Ukraine wants to be heard around the world, but we must also learn to listen to the wider world in return. Ukrainian identity is European, but that shouldn't mean ignoring the West's problematic imperial past and often present, or overlooking the rich diversity of the wider world. The Ukrainian Institute, the country's major institution for cultural diplomacy, is doing a remarkable work to make Ukraine's voice heard not only in Europe and North America, but also across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In this episode, I speak with two figures at the Ukrainian Institute who work on engagement with the wider world. We discuss the challenges and opportunities of building these vital connections. My guests are Alim Aliev, Deputy Director General of the Ukrainian Institute, and Anabell Ramires, Head of the Department for Asia, Africa, and Latin America. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, Editor-in-Chief of UkraineWorld, and President of PEN Ukraine. You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. This is the final episode of our special series with the Ukrainian Institute, exploring Ukraine's growing ties with the countries of the wider world, including Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Explain Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media outlet about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support our work on Patreon. Your support is crucial as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also support our regular volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both soldiers and civilians. All links are in the episode description. So let's begin. Anabell Ramires and Alim Ali, welcome to this podcast.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk. So we decided to make an overview, kind of a conversation about how Ukraine is communicating, how it communicates with the wider world. Because we talk a lot about Ukraine and the West, but with you, we decided to talk about Ukraine and let's say the countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And of course, this is a big challenge for Ukraine to have this conversation because we didn't have it before so much. And for me personally, it's like, okay, we try to make Ukraine being opened by the wider world, but we also try to open this wider world for us, for ourselves. And you guys who are dealing with this in the Ukrainian Institute, what exactly you understood during these years after the full-scale invasion? What kind of communication we Ukrainians need? Let's start with you, Alim.
Let's start with our department that established half a year ago because on priorities of Ukraine to restart this conversation with the countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America. And what's important to say in my understanding, we lost a little bit time before in a frame of communication with these countries because mostly Ukraine focused on Europe, on Northern America, but not much to these countries. And now we start this deeper conversation with our partners, with the communities and societies in these countries. And it, of course, influencing to our activity. We established a department for Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and we started to do cultural, communicational, academic projects together with these countries. And for me, it's really a new quality of this communication, and it's a new understanding of each other, because every time it's wrote into two ways.
Anabell?
Sure. I think that there are a couple of observations that could be voiced based on our work this 1.5 years. And majorly, the most interesting part is that we have culturally a lot in common with these countries. In my personal perspective, it's even like more similarities than with, for example, European countries or with United States. We have much more attention to our past and roots. And while all of us are discovering this, we are helping each other actually in building the systems of how do we explore these topics and how do we rediscover our cultures. And even institutionally, we support each other as well. Like we make ourselves visible for each other, which is something that feels as a big contribution in our relationships, and something our partners are noting while we work together. There is also a point in languages that the barrier of languages is a little bit more noticeable, let's say, but it also kind of like motivates, as for me, Ukrainian and Ukrainian culture, and specifically Ukrainian artists, to like broaden a little bit their perspectives and study more languages and be more aware of different cultures. Because once this collaboration, right now it's just on the point of pretty much beginning, but as we hope our work, and not only ours, but will lead to more and more contacts, we would see how this particular skill of just learning languages will impact how our culture develops as well. And the same we can say from like the artists from these countries, and that they are pretty intrigued and interested in Ukrainian once they speak with artists from Ukraine. And this is another aspect of our work, that it's about just general interest in Ukraine and studies that might be initiated in these countries. I'm talking about university studies, like researches, that our work is like contributing in impulsing this movement more. And in particularly, we have a different work we do in Ukrainian Institute, which is Coalition of Global Studies. Alim would, I guess, talk more about that, but we are very much eager to explore more students' interaction as well in universities of the countries we work in.
I'm very interested about this topic that you mentioned, that there is a structural similarities between us and, let's say, the countries which are not in the typical orbit of Ukraine's interest, like this attention to roots, or probably a different attitude to modernization, and therefore different attitude to the peasant culture, for example, to the connection to nature. This different kind of environmental art. So art is much more environmental, so connected with nature, both in Ukraine and, let's say, what I've seen from the African artists in different museums, or what I've seen from some Asian artists, etc. And this is very interesting, actually, because indeed we have what kind of similarity we have. The modernization process, urbanization, industrialization was going in a certain sense against our will, right? It was a little bit imposed. In our case, it's clearly the Soviet Union, the Sovietization of Ukraine, which was imposed. And our attitude towards industrialization and modernization is very, very ambiguous, because we understand that it led to the increase of the quality of life, more urbanization, but at the same time, huge number of deaths, artificial famine, collectivization, etc. And we can find the similar patterns elsewhere, right? So it's when I and my colleagues and Ukrainian writers, for example, from Pen Ukraine, which were also publishing this text within our initiative, our common initiatives, when I was explaining to them what to do, I was trying to say, let's look about our similarities which are going beyond some ideological differences. Like we can find ourselves in ideologically very different towards different questions: Russian aggression against Ukraine, United States, Western imperialism. But let's look at things that are in common rather than different. Alim, tell me whether you think this approach works, or still, because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes these ideological differences still prevail. What do you think?
Yeah, first of all, you should know your partner country with whom you start this conversation. And to be honest, it's a lack of knowledge in Ukraine about these countries, and we should do this homework before starting any activities with this country, to prepare our own experts, because sometimes I see how we use Ukrainian experts who pretty well in activities in European countries, and they trying to use this the same approach, for example, in Brazil or in South Africa.
It doesn't work.
No, of course. And that's why we should deeper understand the country, history, culture, political life, etc., etc., etc. And after that, you can find a lot of commonalities between. For example, how we are working with different countries. We're trying to find topics that united Ukraine and, for example, Brazil. Or sometimes it can be a topic of ecocide. Sometimes children, sometimes multiculturalism, etc., etc., etc. And after, you see a lot of commonalities between you and your counterpartner. And that's why our approach now, we are using, for example, collaborations between Ukraine and foreign artists. And second, we include Ukrainian component into main festivals, forums, events in particular country. It gives us this better understanding of local audiences. And of course, it gives more vibrant voice for Ukrainian artists in this particular country.
Anabell?
Yeah, to expand on what Alim said, I guess the key idea why we went for the collaborative format is exactly not to be imposing topics. And not even imposing topics for our artists, because sometimes we want one particular, like for example what Alim said, like there is a topic about ecology, about ecocide, and we feel like we can go that direction, but then artist comes and like it's very important that what we do artistically, that what they do artistically, it's not an agenda, it's not the political statement. And that's why when they start to talk together, like artists, something very interesting comes out usually. For example, in one of our projects, we invited Mexican artist Rolando Hernandez to visit Slavska, and we planned pretty much like one thing, but then he came, he met Ukrainian families that were exactly at that point staying in the residency where he came. He also met Ukrainian artist Dmitro Bryzuk, and they little bit changed the concept of what we wanted to do by their interaction. And they brought together, they made musical instruments, they found out a lot of traditions that are similar. Like, for example, Rolando was very impressed by the Malanka costumes because it's pretty much very similar to what happens in Mexico in Oaxaca mountains where he's from. And so we couldn't expect that because it just happens in a natural communication process, something that you can never plan as a manager. And this is what is beautiful for us, to just catch this and give it a space to happen. And by this interaction, creating the third topics we never thought we would have in common, like something that is not that expected. And this pretty much gives us a very good then understanding of what Alim said, of like our audiences, what can be explored together. There is also a point about participating in the big festivals, like Alim said, because in these cases it's about hearing, it's about listening to what's going on. When we like participate in big festivals in Africa or in Latin America or in India, it's as if you come and you have an immediate connection to the problems that those artists are talking about. And as we work with artists, we also know that they sometimes are thinking about something that is immediate, but also something about the future. And these conversations are giving us much more value as well, because we can see where we are going all together and whether we can shift it somehow or change it somehow.
I would like to make a little bit of personal shift, and I would like to talk a little bit about you, about your origins, because they're very interesting, and how you look inside yourself. And also, it's very interesting for Ukraine as well, you as personalities. So tell me about how your origins help you to get through and maybe a little bit extend the vision of Ukrainians themselves in the world. Because I am really a little bit sick of this idea that, you know, Ukraine comes back to Europe and Europe is our home. Well, it's pretty nice, but it really seems that in the past years we were kind of too much focused on this. It's good to be focused on this. It's good to be focused on this European vector, but at the same time, it makes you blind towards the dark spots of Europe, about European imperialism, etc. Tell me how your personal story helps you to do this work. Anabell.
In a direct way, because my father is from Latin America. He is from Nicaragua, which is one of the most, let's say, problematic countries in terms of relationships with Ukraine and generally with the world. And it gives me a lot of a little bit broader perspective of what intercultural connections can be, because despite, especially what you said about ideological differences, because this is something that was every time, like I was growing up, in the table of the conversations, like we always talked about that. And so it gave me the idea that the culture of this country is not something I need to just not be interested about just because I don't like the politics of this country. And I'm talking about Nicaragua. But then it also gave me the interest in other countries of Latin America. And then by discovering and learning about that, it immediately brought me to the African continent. And from there, it's just impossible. You just go to Asia in your studies. So it just gives a natural desire to help Ukraine be visible also for these countries, because when I was growing up, I had material to base my studies with. And what I see is that even if there is some child in Mexico interested in Ukraine, this person might not have access to anything. So this is a direct mission I feel like having, to just make sure this person has access to us, direct access to knowledge if this person wants to.
But tell me how people in Latin America perceive you and how you perceive this connection, because I assume Spanish is your native language, and are people surprised? Because it's always very interesting, right? We have a podcast within our initiative about Brazil, and we talk about the Brazilian Ukrainians, and it's very, very interesting that you realize that a person comes from Brazil and says, well, I'm Brazilian Ukrainian, and here's my Ukrainian, and he starts to Gutopashko, he starts to speak Ukrainian. So how do people react to that? First, they understand that you have these origins from Nicaragua, but at the same time you are in Ukraine, and this connects a very interesting story.
Well, because of my appearance, they first don't really understand I'm from Ukraine. And a lot of people in Ukraine don't understand that I'm Ukrainian. So it just takes some time to make things clear if it comes to the conversation. And the second reaction usually is curiosity. Like, how did it happen? How do you feel? Like, do you feel more Latin American or Ukrainian? And then you tell that I am Ukrainian. I cannot feel Latin American because I've never, I was not growing up there. So my identity is only based on what happened here while I was growing up. So that leads to very interesting conversations usually, or to some strange situations, but that we will skip.
This is, I will ask Anabell after this podcast for off-records. So, Alim, you're currently and Crimean Tatar, and you have, I guess, a very different connection that, for example, me, with the Turkic world, with the world of Turkic languages and Turkic cultures, and with the Muslim world. Tell me about this a little bit more.
Yeah, we're joking with Anabell that, Anabell, Ramires, and Alim Aliev represent Ukraine state policy on cultural diplomacy. Wow. and for me, it's cool, yeah, because when we're talking with the entire world about values, and when we are talking about multiculturalism, I think it's important not just talk about some theoretical materials, but when you just represent this multiculturalism of your country, it's great. Crimean Tatars were people who born on frontier. We are born on crossroads in Crimea, yeah? And it means that we understand enough a Ukrainian European context, but also we understand Turkic Muslim context. And first time when I was in Indonesia, it was really so surprising for locals about Muslims not as minority in Ukraine, but as indigenous people in Ukraine. And we start this important conversation with Indonesian intellectuals, journalists, opinion leaders about a lot of myths and stereotypes. Because, as you know, for example, one of the biggest stereotypes in Islamic world is that Russia and Putin, one of the biggest friends of Islam. And when I start to explain that our war started in 2014 with the occupation of Crimea, and the first victim of this civilian victim of this war was Reshat Ametov, who killed in Crimea in March 2014, and he was a Muslim. And now the Muslim population, Crimean Tatars, one of the most vulnerable group in Crimea, it really gives this another understanding of Ukraine and Ukrainian society. And it's important. But after, when we are talking, for example, with our partners in Latin America or in South Africa, where we can talk about indigenous people and how we protect these rights and how the arts of indigenous people represent your country. And it's another way how I can talk about my country, about my activities through my background, for example.
It's very, very interesting because there are lots of layers. And for those of you who are interested in Crimea, there is a podcast with Rory Finin. Well, quite a long time ago, we made it before the full-scale invasion, how he describes in his book how Ukrainian authors were very, very much interested in Crimea. And they're like, of Kotyubinsky, Olesya Ukrainka, their gaze, their glance about Crimea was totally different than this imperial glance of the Russian literature. And another podcast, very recent, that we've made with Botakoska Sembekova, when a very interesting scholar from Kazakhstan/Switzerland, when she says that basically in the Soviet Union, the colonization of Central Asia, during the colonization of Central Asia, the difference was between the so-called Europeans and so-called Muslims. So the Russian colonizers, and not only Russian colonizers, were presented as Europeans against the Muslims. So the Muslims were actually considered as a, well, let's say, lower race or something like that. But it also tells us that this story of Russian opposition to the European colonialism is actually a very fake story, because Russians were using the same instruments as European colonizers.
And in this frame, I want to add that one more that through my background I can explain about Ukraine is this war. It's our existential war, not first of all for land, for our identity, and for our vision of future. And it's our anti-colonial war. And in the frame of colonization, I explain that Crimean Tatars, now we have this process of recolonization of Crimea by Russia. And when you give this historical context of Crimea and explain why Russia is empire, because be honest, sometimes Russia present itself as an anti-empire. And now when we are explaining our war as an anti-colonial war, you of course touch this topic.
We will touch it very soon in this episode. But before that, I would like to make 2 points. The first point is that Crimea is so rich in history that in order to prove that it is Russian, you need to erase this history. And this is what is Russian approach, because Crimea was, whatever you call it, Crimea was and is Crimean Tatar, but it is Greek, it is Italian, it is Genovese, it is Roman, it is Byzantine, it is whatever, Ukrainian. So can you imagine this machine of exterminating and erasing history? And I think this is very important, because we know how Russia is erasing the traces of this history in Crimea. And the second point is that it's also Ukraine as a global story, because Anabell, you probably, when you go to Latin America, when you talk to people from Latin America, probably religious aspects plays a role, right? The Catholic aspect. And Ukraine is also a Catholic country, we can say, right? Ukraine, the Catholicism plays a very important role. The Greek Catholics play a very important role. So Ukraine is the most successful case of, harmonizing the split between the Eastern and Western Church. But also all the Abrahamic religions are here, right? The Judaism is here, Islam is here, Christianity is here. So it's amazing. It's a very interesting, amazing global story. Alim, you talked about this a little bit, colonialism, imperialism. So it's very hard. I find it very hard, actually, very challenging to talk about colonialism when we talk with people from Africa, when we talk with Indians, when we talk with Indonesians, when we talk to, I don't know, by the way, about Latin America. So it's a very challenging, because in the stereotypes, right? There is a stereotype that Europe is a colonizing power, and Africa, Asia, Latin America have been mostly colonized. And in the 20th century, Soviet Union was anti-colonial power because they were left, and Lenin was writing about anti-imperialism, whatever. So it's very difficult to explain that Soviet Union is a colonial power, that Russia was a colonial power and still is. Do you succeed in that? Or you face a wall of misunderstanding and an argument, no, that's ours, that's our story, and don't just take this colonial story. Because I've heard a lot of this from my African or Asian interlocutors that, look, don't compare, please, this European colonialism with what Russia is doing.
Yeah, and first point, don't compare. European colonialism, another type of colonialism is modern Russian colonialism. Yeah, and it's not about sea salt colonialism. It's another approach, but it's about empire and about ambitions. It's about trying to destroy identity. Yeah, and trying to do with you. From you as an object of geopolitical life, not as a subject. That's why we just explain about it through the personal stories, through the artistic stories. And here, when in political level, it's so hard to explain why it's an anti-colonial war. Through the artistic and academic spheres, it's much more easier to do it in our countries.
Anabell?
Yeah, absolutely agree that any type of comparison here leads to a misunderstanding. Because even the term colonialism we interpret in so many different ways, and each country has its own approach to also weaponize this term in like literally their own political games inside the countries, and this might lead us to be accidentally trapped in the game between the different views inside the countries. And specifically when we talk about the countries that didn't made their mind about what their attitude to colonialism is, or they are trying to make up their minds right now. So every time we kind of approach this, we need to really have deep conversations to people who are aware of what's going on in the country. And we usually try to, in our when we start a project, we barely ever touch this in the beginning. It comes later on every time anyway, but already in the context of a very particular project with a very particular artist who is ready or not to discover that and to share with us their opinion. For example, it is hard to even say Latin American approach to colonialism is that, because the way it is in Argentina is completely opposite, literally opposite in Mexico. So it just would not work. And it's not even the question whether we succeed or not. We will just miserably fail the moment we just start that. So our approach is about like each particular case situation that we whether we understand, we can touch it or not. In which way we also can touch it, because there are some good things we can teach each other in the interpretation of this term, and also, as I said in the very beginning, like a building of system of how do we analyze this and how do we approach our histories. Yeah, I think that this is not the common ground we can play around easily.
But what interests me is not really the common ground. What interests me is how we can draw a map of imperialisms in plural and colonialisms in plural. And here, the Indian experience, like, can we compare the artificial famine in India, Churchill, and 43, if I'm not mistaken, or 44, during the Second World War, and the Stalin's artificial famine against Ukraine and Kazakhstan? Can we compare? Can we first compare famine in Kazakhstan and Ukraine? I think we can, but it's very interesting to stress on the differences and stress on the details. And on this podcast, you have a lot of episodes where we try to approach this, and you will find them in the description. One is, for example, between settler colonialism and extractive colonialism. Another one can be between sea colonialism or maritime colonialism and continental colonialism. Another two concepts very important is racism versus assimilation. So when you colonize, what you do, you impose a very unsurmountable difference to the colonized and say, you're a different race, you will never become the same as me. Or you proceed with assimilation, saying you're the same as me, so you approach to me as far as possible and as much as possible. And these are very different approaches to colonization, right? And for example, in Russian case, the assimilation technique was much more present. And the tool of this assimilation technique is language. And it's very interesting to. So I do think I'm actually interested in this conversation not in order to impose Ukrainian story on others, but in order to enrich our common understanding of what imperialism and colonialism means. Anabell?
Yeah, a question here that often raises is why would we compare? Why would we try to compare and name something we call colonialism as like one term that describes like that has this and this and this categories, and imperialism is this and this. Like, what is the reason of why would we do that in the first place? Like, how it helps? It's something that we discuss a lot among us and among artists as well, because sometimes it just leads to oversimplification that then erases some complex cases even inside the countries. So one country can be perceived as the colonizer as well as being colonized from a perspective of different people inside this country. And so that leads to the question of what we are trying to understand often is how the country wants to approach this question. Like, what is the policies inside the countries towards that. When we go to South Africa or Mexico or Argentina, whether they use this term, how do they use this term, and what do they mean by using this term, rather than trying to compare and understand in our terms, like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You should have this common vocabulary, the same vocabulary. And what gives us this vocabulary, it's academia. And that's why our approach to work in academic sphere, for me, it's crucial, because you decolonize a knowledge about you. and you gives this more opportunity to know about you from yourself. That's why, for example, we have our long-term program, Lysiak Rudnitsky program, that support academic initiatives, or our online courses about different topics of Ukraine, civil society, the history of civil society, Ukrainian culture, Crimea, etc., etc., etc. And last huge state initiative is a global coalition for Ukrainian studies that gathered different universities around the world into one network, and just give this opportunity to launch Ukrainian studies or to launch a course about Ukraine, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian society. And it gives better understanding, of course, to next generation about your country.
Let me ask you this. So, what are the most difficult cases? Like maybe what were the most difficult countries for you at this moment? What were the most difficult cases of understanding? Can you tell me a little bit about this?
The main difficulty we face mainly it's related to the accessibility of the knowledge, and also literal entrance to the countries, both to Ukraine and to those countries, especially when we talk about African continent. It is not easy for Ukrainians to enter, as well as for Africans to enter Ukraine, like for many years, because of what Alim said in the very beginning and what you mentioned as well. Yeah, it's something that has to be done in future as our top priorities, to have new perspective of how do we interact with these countries in terms of just simple travel and access, because this is a big challenge.
Distance, it's one of the challenge, to be honest. Different procedures as visa issues, etc., etc., etc. It's when we are talking about this physical connection, but when we are talking about symbolic connection, it's, for me, sometimes not, of course, not all, but different societies, different communities has vision to you from Russian optics, and sometimes it's very hard to change. But we know that how to build the trust. It's very hard process. But through these projects, artistic projects, cultural projects, it's can do much more easier and quicker. One of the projects that I think it's important to Ukraine is bring foreigners to Ukraine, bring philosophers, historians, bloggers, journalists, artists, managers here to Ukraine, and to see on the ground what is Ukraine. We have a lot of success cases when such people return to their countries and launch projects about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just to mention that this about physical distance and like hardships connected to travel are not just technical. it's crucial, because what we see that the moment we are in a common physical space, as Alim said, somebody coming to Ukraine or our artists coming to the countries, it makes a whole difference. It's absolutely different way of working. This connects to different specificities of how people just approach work, approach communication, but in our case, that is the biggest challenge and the biggest knowledge we gained from all these years, that we can build a project only if we have a time and space where two people are in one room.
Now we have a time when it's a lot of attention to Ukraine from these countries, and we should use this opportunity. For example, months ago, Ukrainian jazz band presented our country in one of the biggest jazz festivals in Indonesia, Java Jazz Festival. Or Ukrainian writers and poets present Ukrainian voices in one of the biggest literature festival in Guadalajara book fair. And we should use this opportunity not only to present your own voice, but also to listen our partners.
And just a footnote that within our common initiative, UkraineWorld, Pan-Ukraine and Ukrainian Institute, we have a series of texts by Ukrainian writers in mostly Latin America, but not only, and in top newspapers. And actually, they're having a lot of feedback there. Maybe my last question to you. What do you think that Ukrainians can tell people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America? What kind of thing? Because I will share with you one thing. I was talking to a big audience in Tbilisi just recently in Georgia, and I was saying about this concept that I express very often, that Ukraine is a country of despite, this idea of despite, freedom despite slavery, love despite hatred, life despite death, etc. And why I was mostly approached by people from non-European countries, from Bangladesh, for example, from Indians who were there. They say, well, that resonates a lot. So with them. So, and there was another article recently written by Artem Chapai, our wonderful writer, and I hope we will publish it. It will be published in South Africa. But the message there is that, well, we are against any type of colonialism, right? European, Chinese, Russian, whatever else. So these can be, and Ukraine actually shows by our fight that it is possible. What are those things, emotions, messages, ideas that you think Ukrainians are actually having to the global world, to the wider world?
Distance not matter enough. Matters values. And when we have a common values, it's much more easier to find commonalities between our societies. And I think it's for this, during this way of understanding each other, it's one of the main messages.
Anabell?
I think that there is a lot to say, but much more to do for each other. In the idea that those countries we're talking about as Ukraine were not very visible before. And while we are looking at each other for the first time, finally, literally looking at each other, trying with this curiosity, like, who are you? This creates a physical shape of presence. And that helps in so many ways, not only to Ukraine, but also to these countries. So I think whatever message behind that might be, the key here is this action of curiosity and visibility, that we actually finally acknowledge each other as somebody interested in ourselves. And that is something that later on, usually in long-term perspective, gives huge fruits in terms of culture, but also in terms of politics and policies and the way how powers distribute around the world.
Thank you, Anabell and Alim. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was Explain Ukraine, a podcast by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. My guests today were Alim Aliev, Deputy Director General of the Ukrainian Institute, and Anabell Ramires, Head of the Department for Asia, Africa and Latin America of the Ukrainian Institute. Let me remind you that Ukrainian Institute is Ukraine's major cultural diplomacy institution, and this episode was the final one in our special series with this institution, exploring Ukraine's growing ties with the countries of the wider world, primarily Asia, Africa and Latin America. Let me remind you that you can support UkraineWorld on Patreon. Your support is crucial as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine where we support both soldiers and civilians. All links are in the episode description. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.